future depends upon education. But are the education systems evolving with time? Are they equipping learners to address the challenges being faced today? Is it time to reimagine education to maximize human flourishing? In the September of 2019, over 20 scientists from across the globe met in Quebec, Montreal, to find answers to these pressing questions for the 21st century. They brought in expertise from across international comparative education, human developmental and educational psychology, neuroscience, cognitive science, economy, and philosophy, to arrive at an assessment process which is scientifically credible, legitimate, relevant, and inclusive. Contributed by more than 300 eminent experts from over 45 countries over the last 2.5 years. Today, we are proud to launch the full report of the International Science and Evidence-Based Education ISEE assessment that contributes to re-envisioning the future of education and feeds into UNESCO's Futures of Education. This report maps 3 key messages. 1. Personalized education for flourishing is a human right. 2. Learning is a cognitive emotional process. 3. Science and evidence must be the foundation for education policy. Take a step with us to reshape education systems for a sustainable and peaceful world, and identify knowledge gaps and priorities for future multidisciplinary research in the field of education. Download your copy of the ISEE assessment report today. Every child is different, and we owe each of them an education that is fun, rewarding, and relevant for their flourishing and that of the planet.
Good morning. My name is Salvatore Arico. I'm the Master of our ceremony today. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the launch of the International Assessment on Science and Evidence-Based Education, ISEE. This assessment was conducted over the past 2.5 years through the pandemic by the UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development. And it has involved more than 300 contributors from 45 countries. At the very outset, I'd like to invite all of us to help amplify today's conversation through respective social media handles. A couple of words on the Institute, the Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development is based in New Delhi, in India, and it was established with the support of the government of India as an integral part of UNESCO. It is the first and only Category 1 research institute in Asia Pacific, and it focuses on achieving the Sustainable Development Goal 4, in particular, on education, and its target 4.7 towards education to foster peaceful and sustainable societies. Recently, UNESCO has released its much-awaited re-imagining Our Futures Together, a new social contract for education. And this landmark report insists on the need to there is a need, based on this report, to adopt a scientific approach to operationalize the social contract in question. So, the International Assessment on Science and Evidence-Based Education tackles this fundamental question of what kind of education is needed and for what kind of society in the future. Now, a couple of words on scientific assessments. Scientific assessments are essentially science and evidence-based social processes that are allowed to assess in a systematic manner knowledge and to bear the result of such an assessment to meet the needs of policymakers and other stakeholders. And this applies to education as well. Examples of scientific assessments are the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that we are all familiar with, the work of the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And this is a first ever scientific assessment of education as far as applying the method that has been applied in the context of those examples that I just gave. Okay, let's now turn to our event. I would like to start by welcoming the opening remarks by Ms. Naja Vallaud-Belkacem, former Minister of Education and Research of France, who has served as the co-chair of the Assessment Advisory Board. And Madame Belkacem va nous présenter ses remarques par vidéo. Merci.
Is going to speak on video.
To be present with you virtually on the occasion of the launch of the International Science and Evidence-Based Education Assessment, Re-Imagining Education. The UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development embarked on the ambitious ISEE assessment in 2019, and in spite of the challenges presented by the COVID-19 pandemic, has since commendably convened over 300 scientists and experts from 45 different countries from diverse disciplines. The findings presented in this publication will undoubtedly pave the way for policy and decision-making for future education systems, when now the world needs more than ever visions for a future that must be more sustainable, resilient, socially just, and fair. The release of the publication comes at a pivotal point as the world attempts to return to some sense of normalcy while grappling with new and evolving variants of the COVID-19 pandemic. The ISEE assessment is a first of its kind assessment that contributes to re-envisioning the future of education, to build more resilient, sustainable education systems that can weather crises such as the one we are currently facing with. Key findings from the assessment point towards a system which provides personalized education for flourishing as a human right and recognition that learning is a cognitive, emotional process. What is truly distinct about the assessment is the adoption of the science and evidence-based approach, which emphasizes the need for policymakers to adopt scientifically backed decision-making approaches for the future. Furthermore, a unique aspect of the assessment is its multidisciplinary nature, the bringing together of experts from disciplines as diverse as neuroscience, education, philosophy, psychology, data and evidence, sustainability and technology, and so on. I feel indeed privileged to be involved in the advisory process of the assessment, and I congratulate UNESCO MGIEP and all the 300 experts involved in the assessment who came together to present such unique findings, which will certainly provide robust guidelines for future education policy.
Thank you very much, Madame Belkacem. And I would like now to invite Stefania Giannini, UNESCO Assistant Director General for Education, to also give her opening remarks. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Salvatore. Bonjour.
Thank you so much, Salvatore. Hello, everyone. Welcome to UNESCO. I am very happy to be with you physically. And I would like to greet all speakers today, including my dear friend Najat Vallaud-Belkacem, who presented her comments by video. So I worked a lot with her in the previous years. And there's also my dear friend Ananda, who, as you know, is a reference contact point for us at UNESCO, but not only, but especially regarding the points that we are going to address today, everything related to transformation. So let me highlight how important such topics are, especially in the current context. I think that the mission of this UNESCO Institute on Peace and Sustainable Development is as relevant as ever.
Been with us today talking about reimagining education and the launch of this important report on reimagining education which is the result of the International Science and Evidence-Based Education Assessment. Just last week here in Paris, many of you were in this room, as I was. UN Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed briefed member states on the Transforming Education Summit that will be convened this year in September by the Secretary General as part of our common agenda. I don't want to go in detail on the purpose, the process of the summit. Everybody knows, I'm sure, in this room and the people connected. I wish to say that actually the summit is about transformation, the power of transformation in and through education. And such a transformation, we know, can only happen with vision and evidence. Let me focus a little bit on these two relevant dimensions we need. Vision to radically rethink education for the times ahead. Evidence to better understand the shortcomings, of course, and even failings, unfortunately, very many we know, of education systems today. And as it concerns the vision, we will be guided by the Futures of Education report that, as you know, an international commission chaired by Madam Sahle-Work Zewde, President of Ethiopia, released last year at UNESCO, and which calls for a new social contract for education based on the ambition, a strong ambition of rebalancing the most relevant systems of relationships with each other, with technology, and the planet. And as it concerns the vision, I think that the reports can provide a real great opportunity to member states to engage in dialogues on transformative actions as they set course for a renewed education system. And this is a bit the work to do in the coming months. This is an approach which has manifold consequences for pedagogy, curriculum development, teaching models, and the very organization of schools. As it concerns evidence, which is the other important dimension that especially this report we are launching today is about, we can say that transformative actions must be rooted in evidence, in data. And this is the foundation for effective policy and decision-making. Unfortunately, we know very well, as researchers, as policymakers, as politicians, that the nexus between science-based outcomes and policymaking is not always so obvious and so permanent. And this is, I think, what we have to build. And this is, I think, Ananta, is also the purpose of this exercise and the work we have to do in the coming months. Well, the assessment, the International Science and Evidence-Based Education Assessment, comes in here as a rich and unique initiative that mobilizes the multidisciplinary expertise of 300 experts, as you see on this cover slide, from 45 countries, in an open and inclusive manner. It takes on board the latest evidence from cognitive sciences that carry impact on how we learn, covering important areas as brain plasticity, coping with emotions, and the importance of mother tongue instruction. I still have in mind a nice, important conversation we had last year, I think, just preparing the launching of the report, focusing on the importance of second language and first language acquisition and the process of translating these outcomes in policies. Well, such a comprehensive perspective is absolutely important, relevant for connecting cutting-edge research informed by science while recognizing the importance of local, regional, and global contexts. Connecting basic fundamental research and educational policies is actually one of the main purposes of the initiative. On another side, the assessment provides also a very interesting diachronic perspective on how education has evolved over the past 50 years, and policy recommendations related to that for change. It takes a humanistic approach based on the notion of human flourishing. It's an important notion. It's very much linked to the etymology of education itself, which, as we all know, I'm sure, comes from Latin and means, keeping out, educare. It's, taking out from what you have inside, somehow unlocking the potential of human beings. And having said that, I think that this report, at least as I see this report in the big picture of many initiatives we are running in education this year, is coming to strengthen the science policy nexus in the field of education, and is coming to bring evidence-based outcomes to this humanistic approach to education, which is very much the UNESCO approach. And transformation necessarily is the ground of this notion. The 2030 Agenda by itself is a kind of transformative vision of society. I can also mention Target 4.7, which is the core of SDG 4, and which is about sustainable development, global citizenship, and the role of education to actually transmit and disseminate this knowledge, awareness, and change of behaviors. Well, to conclude, dear Ananta, MGIEP is a strong advocate, is a strong center for connecting very many different fields of research around these topics. And I'm really confident that the findings of the assessment being launched today will provide further valuable evidence to encourage educational renewal, change, transformation, which is everything we are about somehow. It's an ambitious project once again, but I think that in the big picture, we can really go ahead along these lines. I thank you very much, and I wish you a fruitful discussion in the panel and along the discussion today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Giannini, especially for clarifying the role of evidence as a foundation for decision makers on education, and helping us seeing this report, this assessment in the broader context of the Future of Education report and the upcoming summit on education. Now we are going to move on to the panel today. We have a panel discussion, and first of all, I'd like to introduce to you the moderators of the panel. We have Ms. Vera Lacaille, the Deputy Permanent Delegate at the Permanent Delegation of St. Lucia to UNESCO, who is a diplomat and an academic. Nous avons le co-modérateur.
We also have our co-moderator, Mr. Michel Bonsan, who's the representative of the government of Quebec at the Permanent Delegation of Canada here at UNESCO. And he was the Secretary General of the National Assembly of Quebec.
Sitting in the first row below on the right sight of the participants, the attendees in the room. And very briefly, I'd like to introduce the panelists who are sitting here on the podium. So we have, starting with Ananta Durayappa, who is the inaugural director of the UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute, and the co-chair of the ISEE assessment. Then we have the other co-chair of the assessment, Professor Nienke van Atteveld, who is full professor at the Department of Clinical Neuro and Developmental Psychology at the Free University of Amsterdam. In addition, we have the following panelists. We have Jo van Herwegen, who is Associate Professor in Developmental Psychology at the University College in London. We also have Nandini Chatterjee Singh, Senior National Program Officer for Science of Learning at the UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute, who is a cognitive neuroscientist and physicist by education. Nous avons aussi Grégoire.
We also have Grégoire Borst, who's a professor of psychology, developmental psychology, and cognitive neuroscience of education. So, Grégoire will clarify all of this in French if he wishes to do so. So he's a professor at Paris-Sorbonne University.
Guillermo Rodriguez Guzman, who is the head of Evidence and Data Center for Homelessness Impact in the UK. And may I just clarify that all the panelists have had a direct role in putting together the international assessment on evidence-based education in various capacities. Avec ça, je passe la parole.
And with that, I would like to give the floor to the moderators of our panel, so that that can involve the panelists in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, dear colleagues. Maybe we should start, Michel and myself, by explaining why we are here and why we were asked to moderate this panel. As far as I'm concerned, I'm here because I participated since the beginning, as ADG Education knows, to the discussion on the futures of education report in the executive board before the board agreed to this big project and before the International Commission was launched. And from our discussions in the executive board, I understood that the report was going to be more of a visionary philosophical framework. And that is why my delegation in the board said that there has to be the other side of it, the continuation of it, which should be the science and evidence-based data and input on the future of education. And we put this proposal in the board to the DG to have this international evaluation of education, and the DG immediately replied and agreed to go ahead with it, which allowed both projects, big projects for UNESCO, to be launched in a parallel manner. And now, for those who look at the two reports, will see clearly that in a way they complement each other. So it's like, well, it's like my baby coming through, and I'm very happy to participate in the launching of this report. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vera. My name is Michel Bonsa. I'm the representative of the Quebec government at the delegation of Canada at UNESCO. I would like to greet all of you present here in room 11 at the headquarters of UNESCO, and I would like to greet those who are attending remotely. I am very happy to be involved in the launch of this very important report for education. It's an initiative from the Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development. It's an initiative that started in Quebec, in Montreal. In 2019, it started in collaboration with the chief scientist of Quebec, Mr. Rémy. So obviously, the government of Quebec fully supports this report. It's a report that benefited from the expertise from more than 300 experts. They wondered what worked well and what worked a little bit less well in education systems. We believe that this report could bring relevant input to decision makers in the field of education, especially in the well-documented aftermath of COVID-19 on education systems globally. We became more aware of the digital divide and its impact in terms of access to education. And by the way, we're very happy to see that the report addresses the issue of digital tools and the necessary balance between the use of EdTech and regular education activities, as well as the ethical use of AI in education. And to conclude, I wish to say that I hope this report plays an important role in the implementation of SDG 4. So now, let's start with the first question from Mr. Director of the MGIEP Institute, Mr. Ananta Durapa. So, what's ISEE and why is it being implemented right now?
Michelle, for that question. I think the background and the context is primarily the SDGs, and we all know that it was signed in 2015, the expected results on 2030, and we are pretty much right now in the midway stage of this ambitious agenda that had all 193 countries sign on. And we're getting mixed signals at that time in the sense that what's worked, what has not worked. There are some studies we say we're really on track, we're doing really well. And then you also have many studies we say we're really off the track. And it's, in fact, we might want to rethink about the whole, the SDGs, especially 4 and as the ADG had stressed 4.7, which is very, very dear to the Institute and is the core mandate of the Institute. But we also know that it's also very closely related with the whole education series. So that's why I thought the Institute decided to take this on. So, and for some of the examples that on the contradiction, contrary to what many people think, we find that that more than 75% of parents, teachers, and even students want an education that is focused more on their well-being rather than just very high-pressured exams, schools, and performance, which many of us think is where the main push is by these relevant 3 parties. But that's not the case. And in fact, a lot of them are looking for something a lot more broader. And it fits very well within the UNESCO's approach to education, which is a humanistic approach. And in fact, one really looks back at Article 26 of the for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it calls for a humanistic approach to education. And so we wanted to sort of see, is that the case or not? And that was one of the main objectives of the assessment. And then one of the things that we also found very surprising is that more than 10 to 20% of children have learning differences who are completely ignored by the education system, even under the inclusive education agenda. I'm talking about kids with the 4 Ds, the dyslexias, dyscalculias, and so forth. And I talk that from personal experience because my oldest was diagnosed with acute dyslexia at a very young stage. So that comes from a personal experience. And then as the ADG also had expressed, 40% of the global population don't have access to mother tongue. And it's interesting because it seems like Freire's notion of the pedagogy of the oppressed is really working across our education system. But these were from various different studies. So we wanted to sort of say, is there any truth in this? Is there evidence for this? And so forth and so on. So in 2019, we convened a group of 20 experts, multidisciplinary, and believe me, it was one hell of a heated discussion over 3 days, because these were people who had never worked together, and therefore also very suspicious. I'm not sure how many of you have been in a room with academics from very different disciplines. We don't trust each other. It's something we are superior to the others. And so forth and so on. But it was a fantastic journey, I think, in terms of, but we all believed that an assessment was needed. And many of them really didn't understand the term assessment in the first place, because I think many of you who are in the education sector, when you think assessment, you think PISA, or you think TIMSS. No, this was a much broader assessment of the state of education. And within that, we will assess PISA. And in the report, you'll see what the experts say about PISA, TIMSS, and some of these other, what I call pesky exams. So we started with 2 fundamental questions. Is the education system serving the right purpose? Have we forgotten that? And you know, I was very, very encouraged when I looked at Article 26 of the Universal Declaration. It so clearly states what we were supposed to do for education right back in 1948. Just after the experiences of the World War. And then, are we equipped to address those pressing challenges we face today? So that was the really in-depth analysis of these systems that we have. So 2.5 years later, 300 over experts from multiple disciplines. I think we counted more than 10 disciplines that were involved. 4 volumes, and you can see the output at the back. We actually gave very strict marching orders to the experts that they should not write anything more than 5,000 words, but nobody ever listens these days, so we have this 1,000-page report. But a lot of it was based on design to make it reader-friendly. I would suggest that you take the scan code and read it digitally, because then it's so much easier to find things that you are really interested in finding rather than flipping these pages. And that's the beauty of digital. One of the beauties of digital, of course, we have problems with that, and the assessment also talks about that. So I want to emphasize, to finish off, that the process used in this assessment is as important as some of the key findings that it comes in. As I said, it's transdisciplinary, and I think that is a necessary condition, actually, when you want to look at global societal problems, because so many different perspectives. And we found very interesting of how a neuroscientist looks at it versus a philosopher versus an international comparative education versus a traditional education on the same issue, but very different perspectives. And so this introduces the notion of consensual science, because there's so much a gray area that we have to get consensus from this multidisciplinary on what they're confident about from that evidence and what we really need to work more towards when we have gaps in our knowledge. I remember with the IPCC, with the climate change in 1992 or so forth, when the first report came out, there was only about 75% confidence of the 2-degree temperature rise. The latest report is 95, 99% confident. Data has improved, information has improved, and I think in education it's necessary that we have such a systematic process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ananta. Maybe now I can ask Nandini a question. You are one of the pillars of the Mahatma Gandhi Institute, if I may say so, and you co-chaired one of the working groups in the course of the work on the ISEE. I'd like to ask you like the magic question. Has education provided for the betterment of society over the last 50 years?
So I'm honored by those comments right at the outset. And it's a loaded question indeed. But what the assessment finds is that it really depends on the benchmarks that you're using to look at what we mean by betterment of society. Okay. So if you'd use the human capital approach, which was designed and conceptualized by the economics, whereby literacy and numeracy are prioritized, and the understanding is that this will lead to economic growth, then certainly some people, some societies, some countries have benefited enormously. But, and the but is what sets this apart, is, as Ananta already pointed out, Article 26, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, says education should be for well-being and to also achieve and help human personalities develop to their fullest potentials. Okay. So that's something we seem to have missed out. And if that has been the focus, then we have not benefited. But the assessment also finds, and this is where there is a twist to the tale, is that all learners actually learn differently. And therefore, the first important message or finding from the assessment is personalized learning for human flourishing is a human right. Okay. We have expanded that whole idea to make it personalized because we owe it to the learner to be able to provide an education system where they can achieve their full potentials to become the best version of themselves. Okay. And if indeed this is to contribute towards human flourishing, I think we need to come back to a central idea of what we mean by human flourishing. If it is indeed to achieve not just the best versions of ourselves, but the best versions of the societies we live in, because humans are social emotional beings, we have to prioritize relationships over economic growth. And this is not just relationship with the self or with the other, but also relationships with the environment. And only then will we be able to think of peaceful and sustainable societies. Until these become the pillars of education, that will remain quite a dream and will no longer become a reality. So we need to come up with a real big transformation where we put relationships at the center and find ways on how to cultivate them in our children, in ourselves, in everything around us. So maybe I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. Maybe it's very much a question of implementation, because listening to you, I remember the Delors report. That was quite remarkable and very visionary, but we couldn't see the impact really on education and then on societies. But I'll move to Nienke. You're a professor of neuroscience and you co-chaired the INSEE Evaluation Commission. Can I ask you, what is the importance of science and evidence in policy making? Tell us a bit of this whole brain approach to education. What does it mean for our present education systems, and how is it necessary for this personalized education, which is the INSEE first key message?
Thank you, Vera, for this question. So about the importance of science and evidence, we all know that scientific insights progress, so it's important that policy keeps up, as new scientific knowledge can have important implications for how we need to view education and its goals and its purposes. So an important example is that in the learning sciences, including neuroscience, scientific research over the past decades has revealed important insights about how children learn and develop. And this also becomes clear from the ISEE assessment, especially in working group 3, but also in the other working groups. So from modern brain research using so-called neuroimaging techniques, we have seen that there is no clear distinction between cognition and emotion. So the cognitive and the metacognitive and the social emotional functions, they are densely interconnected, and so is their development. So during the period of schooling, brain functions do actually not develop in isolation, but in interaction with each other. They need each other to develop, but also in interaction with the environment. So they're shaped by what a child experiences and what kind of input they receive. And this depends on, for example, cultural beliefs and values, and also the direct home environment and its conditions. So as Nandini also already mentioned, that a very important message in the ISEE assessment is that each child learns differently, and these unique developmental trajectories underline these differences. So these unique developmental trajectories during which the cognitive and the non-cognitive functions constantly interact, and this interaction is needed for their development and also to develop flourishing. So this calls for a more holistic approach in which it is recognized that learning is a social cognitive process. And this is what we have termed the whole brain approach in the key message number 2 and also the first policy recommendation. So what we mean with this is that the cognitive and metacognitive and social emotional aspects of learning need to be integrated in education. They need to be simultaneously nurtured. So that is an important implication, but it also has implications actually for how we evaluate learners, right? So it's because each child learns so differently, we should move away from the one-size-fits-all standardized testing and focus much more on formative and dynamic evaluation, where each learner is their own benchmark.
Alors, la prochaine question.
Okay, next question is for Ananta. So the assessment comes with a message about merit that puts everybody on the same footing. Now, since you're talking about potential, could you tell us a bit more about potential in a kind of more tailor-made approach to education?
Thank you, Michelle. Before I answer that question, I was just reflecting, and maybe I should say how, when the word science, many people then think that it's just neurosciences and the science disciplines. But it's not, it's much broader than that. So when we say science, we define science as the pursuit and application of knowledge and understanding of the natural and social world following a systematic methodology based on evidence. So it's not just, when you say science, we're just bringing in the learning sciences, even anthropology, philosophy. It's the approach, the process, and then very dependent on the evidence that's able to be gathered. And if there's a lack of evidence, it also identifies that gap so that you can start addressing those shortfalls. And then the second one is a little bit about the question that Michelle is about potentiality and meritocracy. Now, this is an interesting one, and I think it really is opening up a Pandora's box here, because what we have from the assessment is that inequality, or in fact, I prefer the term inequity, is been increasing significantly. And there were some very interesting results which sort of point that the top 10% quantile, and this is within the United States and some of the other countries, but I think it's going to be similar in the rest of the world when we start getting that data, is that the top 10% quantile basically occupies 70% of the most competitive universities and schools. So you have what I think in the literature is an interesting term that I found it very intriguing, is what they call heritage meritocracy, a new form of aristocracy that is emerging. So it goes against the very nature of what meritocracy was even established for, because the idea of ability and effort should decide the life chances of each person. Seems to be something that's fine. But the assessment finds that initial conditions from which the child starts plays such a huge role. And then the whole field of epigenetics, which I'm an economist by training, and I find the way epigenetics, which means gene expression from the environment, fascinating. And I don't think it's actually trickling down to the education system of how important the initial conditions are from where the child starts off with, and already has an advantage. So to impose meritocracy as a one system fits all is actually doing disadvantage to the remaining 90% quartiles, the below the top 10%. And the data shows that. And as we collect more data from other countries, it's going to keep showing those kind of broadening inequities across the world. We also know, and as many of my colleagues have already said, each learner learns differently. But then we impose a one-size-fits-all. And many say how can we provide a personalized education for every child when we have such a large number? It's impossible. The assessment again says there is options. We are able to do that based on some of the findings coming from the advances in digital technology. The assessment even introduces the term of digital pedagogy rather than ICT, because it offers a pedagogy by itself, and the use of artificial intelligence. But again, the assessment also stresses and cautions some of the issues that we must be cautious about when using technology in terms of privacy. Then you get the same situations in the real world of bullying, exploitation, exclusion. So the designs are very important. But the personalized education is within reach. And addressing the third part of the question, or the second part of the question that Michelle, is potentiality. The word potential had already has emerged over the last, we've been here for now about 50 minutes. The ADG talked about the word potential. The Universal Declaration talks about potentials. The definition of human flourishing is based on potentials. So let me read to you what the team, the ISEE team, brought out based on the different definitions of human flourishing. Because every discipline has one. The economics has, the philosophy has, the education community has. So based on that, the definition of human flourishing is both the optimal continuity development of human being potential and living well as a human being, which means being engaged in relationships and activities that are meaningful, that is designed with both their own values and humanistic value in a way that is satisfying to them. Personalized education doesn't mean taking a child out of the system and just focusing on the child, which means it doesn't have any social interactions. You have to, as Nandini already said, we are social animals. We are social beings. So the personalized education emphasizes that. So potentiality is about what the achievement is about the ability to continuously learn. So the idea here is you do not use a one-time exam or evaluation, so which means you learn for learner assessments rather than learner assessments for learning. Right now, what we have is actually the wrong pathway, where you learn for assessments. I'm using the term assessments as learning assessments. So you learn for your exams, rather than the exams are designed to evaluate what you have learned. So the assessment brings up the concept of measuring potentiality, which means you be your own benchmark. And the child is evaluated on the change in learning that is happening periodically throughout the learning trajectory. And that's the notion of potentiality.
Merci Ananta pour cette...
Thank you very much, Ananta, for that excellent answer, which in fact leads us to think about inequities in opportunity and the emergence of a new form of aristocracy through the qualification system. It's inevitable for us to think about these things. I'd like to turn now to Grégoire Borst. You're a professor of developmental psychology and cognitive neuroscience of education. And since you contributed to the working group on learning experience, I was wondering if you could tell us about the how, the why, the what, and the when, and how all of this can be used to optimize the learning experience.
French, but I try French then.
So one of the issues is how we can disseminate more broadly throughout the educational community the idea that education is not exactly what we think of it as, that the development of the child is not just about mastering a range of skills at the end of the process. We still end up making poor decisions. If you think about the COVID crisis, for example, or making mistakes in reasoning. And what we see from developmental psychology is that babies have all kinds of abilities which enable them to learn, in fact. And so the message we need to get across is that cognitive development is not as linear as we imagine it to be, and that, in fact, the issue is to be able to tap into that potentiality. As Ananta was quite rightly saying, things can be very complex, so we can work much earlier on learning processes, on the motivation to learn of children, and that is a very important part of things. In the early stages of development, children learn how to walk, how to speak. They're motivated to learn, but then very quickly we can see that through our educational systems, the pleasure of learning tends to go away. And so how do you preserve that delight in learning? And that is an intellectual notion, and a notion that Théodore Ribot called intellectual emotions. And it's about how you can make these parts and parcel of education. It's very aptly highlighted in the report. How can you optimize learning times? It's not just about the time you spend in school. It's also about time spent outside school, in activities that revolve around school. And how do you tap into these skills you develop in the schoolyard or at home as part of fundamental school learning? And that leads us to think afresh also about the objectives of our curricula, of our education programs, that there's more and more of a disconnect, and we see this from the report, between the skills that we need to address the major issues of the 21st century on the one hand, and on the other hand, the way we still tend to think about education with a tropism towards learning to read and write and learning mathematics. We tend to be overly focused on educational systems that address problems from the 19th century. And this forces us to think afresh also about which skills we want to develop in learners. The report shows that these skills are of a social, emotional, cognitive, metacognitive nature, metacognitive being the ability to think also about how you are learning, think about yourself as a learner, but it's also about the processes that come into play as parts of learning. And education has to be able to work with all of these different kinds of skills. What exactly are the skills that we need? And returning to the Delors report, how do you provide substance to the pillars of learning? Learning to learn, learning to be, learning to think. There is a fundamental stake there. We know that the WHO considers one of the greatest risks to human health today is fake news that's being passed around. And if we do not teach the younger generation to be able to identify fake news, then we're in the face of very severe dangers. There is a need then for us to understand that the environment is changing rapidly, in particular because of digital developments and the crisis we're going through, and that we have to endow our youth with all of the tools they will need to be able to address these challenges, and that we don't necessarily have the answers to at this point. That's in substance what the report says. And to return to what Ananta and others of us have been saying, one of the things that emerges very clearly from research in developmental psychology and cognitive neuroscience in education is that there is no such thing as an average learner. Heterogeneity is the norm. Children learn at different rhythms in different areas, and what's really at stake is the ability for us to approach pedagogical issues in a differentiated way, and not just thinking about children with learning difficulties, for example, autism, problems with calculus or other issues, dyslexia, you name it. Rather, we need to be able to think in differentiated terms about the different circumstances that different children come from. If you come from a social background where you run into considerable difficulties and you start going to preschool, assuming that there is such a thing as preschool in the educational system of your country, during the first 36 months, there will be a huge difference in the number of words that you are exposed to and that you become familiar with. And that is how you end up with children at the age of 36 months who have 500 versus 1,200 words that they are able to take advantage of as part of their normal vocabulary. And this learning of spoken words is a predictor of the learning to write and all the other kinds of learning that will be necessary as part of the educational system. So that's really what's at stake, differentiation in pedagogical approaches.
It was really absolutely mind-blowing for everyone to hear. I just hope that our interpreters were able to run as fast as you were running. So please be kind to our interpreters and don't go so fast, if I may ask. So I'll come now to you. Joe, you are a professor of developmental psychology, and you were part of the working group on context. There has been increasing interest in using findings from sciences of learning like neuroscience, cognitive science, positive psychology. It would be interesting if you could tell us what are the challenges you anticipate in implementing these findings in reimagining education. Thank you.
Thank you, Vera, for that question. I think we've heard already today that learning is complex and it happens in different contexts as well. So learning doesn't just happen in the brain, it happens in our interactions with each other, with the environment and with objects. And that means that we need to think about the different contexts, but also that means thinking about education is not just about what happens in the classroom. Gregoire said this, other people on the panel have said this already, but in terms of policies, to think around how do we make these policies work across these different contexts in terms of politics, economy, cultural policies, and not just educational policies per se. Another challenge related to that might be in terms of the research at the moment very much comes from Western countries and cultures, but to think about how does that then translate to the different cultures and contexts that we have. Research is diversifying, there's more evidence coming, so another question is around how do we keep up in policy with the evidence that comes up on a daily basis, the renewed evidence. And so it might be that we need to revisit these policies, the evidence on a regular basis. A second challenge, I think, is around children are individuals, they learn at different trajectories. Again, we've heard this from various members on the panel. But that means that teachers need to differentiate. That means teachers need to respond to the different individuals. And that means teachers will need specific information about brain development. We in our own research see that teachers are very much interested in neuroscience, development, educational technologies, but that very often they lack an understanding in truly how the brain develops, or about what they can do and how they can use educational technologies. And the reason why there is a challenge here is because if we don't address that need for knowledge so that teachers can apply the right practices for the right children, we might develop some myths related to learning. And obviously those myths, sometimes also framed as neuromyths, can lead to incorrect practices that could maybe do more harm than good in the long term when we're thinking about human flourishing. So I think, giving teachers the tools and the education so that they can support individuals in their learning process is going to be vital. And then finally, if I may, I've got a third challenge, which is around ethical questions. For example, we know and we've seen in the last few years with COVID how important technology is. We know from the report that educational EdTech technologies can really help and support children in their individual learning and learning trajectories. However, we also know there's a lot of inequality or inequity, as Ananta has said. So the question will be is how do we address that? Final point related to ethical questions is around, we know from neuroscience that air pollution, nutrition are very important for brain development. But we also know that's not equally distributed across the world. So the question will be, how do we address those challenges to allow education to flourish?
Alors, la dernière question.
Well, the last question, before we move to questions from the room, will be for Mr. Guillermo Rodriguez Guzman. You are the lead author for Data and Evidence and the head of evidence at Data at the Center for Homelessness Impact. I would like to ask you about the variability of results and the spectrum of different kinds of uncertainty. How can experts formulate policy recommendations to reinvent education, which is the ultimate aim of this whole exercise?
I really wanted to start discussing this whole issue of how we communicate uncertainty just with an example, because I think that really brings a message home. So many of us might have heard of this typical slogan from Nancy Reagan in the 80s. It was basically urging young people in the US to just say no to drugs. As part of all of that impetus, in the 80s, they developed this program that was called DARE. It was something like drug abuse resistant education, and the idea was really simple. It was basically to bring police officers into schools and do a bit of role play with all of the children to basically start communicating the potential damages and the potential impacts of using drugs. So really the idea of this program was really simple. It was to reduce drug use. As a consequence of all of that idea, they decided to run a robust study in Honolulu in 1985 and trying to assess whether this was working. At that point, that study showed that this had promise. It was potentially something that would be implemented on the back of that study. It was actually rolled out across the US over the 80s. It reached millions of children. There was a massive expenditure in resources basically scaling this program, but there was one problem. The program was actually ineffective. It actually increased drug use instead of reducing drug use. So there were many studies that were done as a consequence of this initial study, trying to really unpack what was going on, which was a reason why the authors of that original study failed to communicate the fact that this was potentially a harmful intervention. And everything boils down to a really simple problem, and it's that they were not communicating the uncertainty around the results of the findings that they had. So the problem really is that they were not communicating all of those other scenarios that were consistent with the data that they had. And the key problem is that this is not unique to the DARE project in the US. It's something that is cutting across different types of sciences and different areas of policy. So usually in statistics, when something is called statistically significant, it's basically seen as a bright light. To one side, everything exists and a program is effective, and to the other side, this simply has no impact. The problem is that that's not true. That is actually obscuring a much more nuanced picture that is really the one that we want to understand, is one where we are interested in understanding how well something works and all of the plausible scenarios that are consistent with the data. This really simplistic interpretation, to one side something exists and to the other side it simply doesn't exist, is one of the main culprits of the replication crisis that we have seen in psychology and now that we have seen in other areas of policy as well. So that's not only jeopardizing the credibility of specific programs, but really jeopardizing the credibility of the use of science in policymaking, and that's why we need to take it really seriously. So in my experience working across several areas of social policy, in international development, then in education, and now more recently in homelessness, and actually hearing to all of the colleagues today saying that we really want to be more evidence-based. I think that every single person that we come across really wants to be making decisions on the basis of what works. However, what we really need to understand is that doing something that is evidence-based does not equal certainty. Really, statistical modeling and all of these approaches are only trying to identify signals in really noisy data. So we should really start to acknowledge that statistical models are only providing incomplete and uncertain, yet potentially really useful answers to all of the policy questions that we are trying to pose in this process. So not really thinking, not considering this uncertainty means that policies, despite being evidence-based and evidence-informed, may lead to really cautious changes in policy in some areas, or even worse, it can potentially create harms in other areas, as their example is showing. So really, when communicating evidence, we need to be thinking about all of the other aspects that are relevant. So I think it really boils down to a simple statement, is that when we're discussing evidence, we need to be thinking about the practical and the scientific significance of all of our findings, but most importantly, we need to be considering all of the relevant information. And that is a challenge because it means including additional aspects into how we make decisions. So we need to be presenting results in terms of how well something works, but really thinking about metrics that are understood by teachers. For instance, we can start thinking about months of standard progress rather than something else. We need to start interpreting the findings considering the robustness of the research methods that we were using, not only taking them at face value. It's also really important for us to be thinking about how those statistics were generated. For instance, are those pre-registered? Are those analyses reported in a way that is really transparent? And based on what I was saying before, one of the key things that we need to be thinking about is how do we communicate statistical uncertainty around the findings? Rather than thinking about this really simplistic idea of statistical significance that has been receiving a lot of pushback over the last couple of years. But in addition to that, we really need to start thinking about how is this specific piece of evidence strengthening or shifting our priors in a specific area. We need to be thinking about the causal mechanism. Is it plausible? We need to be thinking about implementation around costs, around context. So I think at the key point, and just going back to my reference to American politics in the 80s, and this is not a comment to any of the colleagues here, is that it is really simple. It is not just thinking about statistical significance, stupid.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the whole panel for a wonderfully told, really, storyline. And I wanted to provide a bit of a transition with the questions, from the panel to questions from the floor. Today we are here to, on the occasion of the launch of the International Assessment on Science and Evidence-Based Education, and as I said at the beginning, I took the liberty to define assessments as social processes. So, in a way, the gathering today is a social process in itself, because the distinguished delegates today, and of course we have other participants, but member states, they are interested in information corroborated by data that is salient, important for them, that is put forward in a way that is cogent, that is clear. Information and data have to be the timeliness and the relevance of the information and the data in general are important. And of course, assessments are not supposed to be policy prescriptive, but simply to inform policy relevant. So I say this is an experiment, a social experiment in itself, because on the one hand, we were presented with the evidence of education, and on the other hand, you may wish to now put forward some questions or comments on how that evidence can best serve you, member states, in the identification and development of policy measures that best fit your respective needs, but also take into account the evidence presented. So I open questions from the audience. Oh, apologize. Canada.
Bonjour.
Good morning, and thank you very much to all the panelists for the presentations. As Mrs. Lacueille was saying, we hear presentations about education on a daily basis, but this is very fresh and very stimulating. Education is a subject that we're all directly concerned with. We've had our own experience at school, we have our own children perhaps, or we have our own ideas about what education should be all about. So it's very interesting to listen to you and to hear you talk about, how these ideas that we all have in mind can actually bear out in the light of evidence. And I was wondering, about the response of teachers to your recommendations, particularly in education systems which might be of a more classic bent. How does the educational community respond to this idea of rethinking approaches and taking account of integrating all the things that happen in the schoolyard or in extracurricular activities? It'd be interesting to hear more about that and to see also how it could be promoted by ministries of education addressing the teaching community and presumably the faculties of education as well.
Thank you for that question. If I may start it off with the first part around how do we change the systems when they're very classic, maybe. I think one way to do it is to start working with teachers and with parents. So we see a lot at the moment about co-producing outcomes. So working from the floor up rather than top down in policy, going from the floor up. And teachers really try out a lot within their classrooms around what works, what doesn't. And I think if we can capture some of that evidence in a better systematic way, I think it will really help us to inform policy making. So that's just part of that question.
Could we also listen to Grégoire on this?
Ouais, je continue en français.
Let me speak French, and I'll try to speak more slowly. So the first thing, as you noticed, is how you train teachers today, training. And there are many challenges because when there are a lot of teachers, when you have highly centralized education systems, obviously you have challenges in terms of teacher training. It raises a lot of challenges. Then there's the initial and in-service training for teachers. And that's something that's even more of a problem. And thirdly, as Joe just said, there's this co-education principle. So parents need to understand what an education community is. It's not just teachers and students. You have teachers, students, parents, and a whole community that's going to take care of the education system. So every stakeholder should be informed, at least on learning, on how the brain works, how the brain is impacted by the environment. There's no opposition between the brain and the environment. Both are highly related. Ananta talked about epigenetics, for example. So the idea is to see how we can bring the community of researchers and the community of teachers together. So we need to try and create third places. If we want more systematic interactions, we need third places that can be either physical or even virtual. We're all aware of initiatives. The Mahatma Gandhi Institute created platforms to stimulate exchanges between students. We want more participatory, collaborative research with all the stakeholders in the education communities. And let's not forget about students, because the users are students. So we need to have their point of view of the education system. And we could draw many conclusions from that. So that's the whole challenge, and research is being built at the moment. We're trying to involve the whole community around co-built research objects, and then we're trying to assess them with robust methodologies to see if they are relevant effects or not. Thank you very much, Joe and Grégoire. I think that this question triggered a lot of responses from the whole panel. So we have Ananta, and then we'll have other responses as well from the other members. Ananta, you have the floor.
I just wanted to alert that recommendations 7, 8, and 9 really relate to that particular question. But we tend to think of teachers as a separate entity rather than they are learners themselves. So the recommendations that we have for learners are also relevant for teachers and even parents. So the whole brain approach is also essential for the teacher training. So I think if we put them under that whole category that we are all learners and we all are subject to these recommendations of a whole brain approach, personalized education, and then of course teachers flourishing is, I think, one of the major things that we have ignored in the whole process. And I think they come under extreme pressure, anxiety, depressions, and on top of that, they're not recognized for what they contribute towards society. And then the inequities, even within the teaching profession, is huge among the elites versus the others. And then, if you are a teacher in a public school versus a teacher in a private school. So it's a complete replica of what we see in the educations, in the learners, as in the traditional notion of students, is also exhibited in the teachers. So I think the recommendations that we suggest also are relevant for the teaching community as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Ananta. Nandini, please.
I just wanted to complete the loop there because taking off from where Ananta left off. So recognizing the fact that teachers have stress and anxiety which they bring to the classroom, because of the fact that there's something called emotional contagion, you also end up communicating that to the students in your classroom. So a student might not have come stressed to the classroom, but the teacher's stress gets communicated, and the classroom becomes a difficult space then. And you can immediately see the impact of it, because as we've been doing teacher training on building social emotional skills for teachers, you can see how they manage to regulate their emotions better and build better classroom climates. And that immediately improves the learning environment for the teacher and the student. So you can actually begin to see how these interventions not only inform the teacher, they inform the classroom, and as a consequence, learning improves, children improve, teachers improve, and it becomes one happy learning environment. So that, I think, kind of completes the loop, which, to come back to the point that you were raising very appropriately.
Well, again, congratulations for the wonderful question, because it allows us to really put the findings of the assessment in context, and I understand that Guillermo would like to also add. Yes, just a final couple of comments. I think that for me, it's really about giving power back to teachers and making sure that they are setting the objectives in a way that makes sense for them, because in reality, the reason why we have teachers is because they are connected with the profession, they're connected with the purpose of that. So really by ensuring that we are setting objectives rather than necessarily how we get to those objectives, I think that creates a really powerful mechanism for people to be a lot more interested in what they're doing. But I think that the other key element there is something that Joe was saying before, which is about how can we map effective practice from the ground, and then starting to think about how we evaluate that in a way that is much more formal and a lot more robust. But I think that the other element connecting to some of the points that was mentioning is about the role that this third sector can be playing in facilitating all of those discussions. And I think that the UK is in a prime position in that sense, because we have a series of organizations called evidence intermediaries that basically work across different areas of social policy. One of them works in education, and basically the role is to bring together all of the research community and try to synthesize the relevant evidence, but at the same time, provide the support to teachers to then act on that evidence. I think that is the second part of the puzzle that we still need to figure out how to tackle, because we are creating the robust evidence base, but how do we implement that is really the next question that we should be focusing a lot of our efforts on. Thank you, Guillermo. I understand we also have questions on this side of the room, Madam.
Merci. Yes, thank you very much. My name is Madame Koulikwalapa. I'm one of the permanent members of the Côte d'Ivoire delegation. I would like to welcome this study, which is highly informative on how important it is to transform education. And it has become a key topic to change the world today. So there's an obvious paradigm shift. You're asking for a more personalized education system. But in Africa, we already have so many problems in terms of teaching. So the teacher-student ratio, taking this new paradigm shift into consideration with this new education system, well, that's complicated. Did you involve other researchers in other countries to help you dig into this study to better adapt it to various contexts? I'm pretty sure that you took into account the education community, decision makers, students, but you know, I'm also a teacher and a researcher. And you know, with the 300 experts, I think it would be great if you could enlarge the network to other researchers in other countries to have even more granular studies to better adapt your proposals. But I would like to say that I think that this study is very appealing, and I'm feeling quite different. I think it's a great change that you're bringing forward. Thank you so much, Madam, for your very relevant question. Let me just give the floor to someone else so that we can better manage the time that we have left. Please, Madam, you have the floor.
I am representing St. Vincent and the Grenadines in UNESCO. Thank you for this very interesting meeting. I mean, we have learned many things, and we hope that we will be able to implement all this. And my question is in the line of the question raised before, and we had already many answers. But I see that this is a multidisciplinary approach. And I found in the report 11 key policy recommendations. I want to know if you are going, how to implement these recommendations, because I think we need a national framework to implement all this. Shall we knock to the doors of the ministries? Maybe we should talk with many ministers how to convince them. What is the plan forward, how to implement all this in our countries? Now you talked about the teacher, the communities, maybe with the evaluation exercise, they know what will happen and you made your conclusions. But at the national framework, how can we help our countries to implement this, especially the first recommendation is reorganizing curricula. And this is very important, how we can implement all this. And you give us the tools, but we need also the means to go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it's back to the panel. If you could please take into account both questions in your answers. Nandini, would you like to get started?
Try and tell you some of the ideas that we are exploring in taking this to ministries. One is we have, and the idea is that today some of the delegations present here will be excited enough to want to take a more concrete step towards implementation. So we are starting out by putting together policy briefs on specific areas. Okay. So one of them, for example, is on curriculum, one on pedagogy, one on assessment, and maybe one on universal screening, on how we might early pick up children who might have different learning needs. Not wait for them to fail, but try and identify those needs early on and try and address them. So we have already embarked on that endeavor, and we are hoping by June, July, we will start coming up with some of these. And clearly these will have to be contextualized for different governments too, depending on what their priorities are. But we hope that these policy briefs will provide a framework in which they might embark on them. And I think that's where, to be honest, the fun and the richness of this whole assessment will begin to bear fruit, is as we work with different governments to try and help them as best as we can to formulate them, and embark on a whole new area of research, understanding how this implementation pans out, enabling, I think, a whole new era of studies that we will want to conduct as they're implemented in different cultural contexts. So we've embarked on the process. I think the future is, hopefully in a couple of years, we can come back and do another discussion like this to see how this panned out.
Nienke, please.
Yeah, I would just like to briefly add something to Nandini related to how you started the question referring to recommendation 11 about the research funding and how to do that like on a national level. But I think actually it's really important also to think about that in a more global context, and because we also need research funding for interdisciplinary and more diverse research projects on an international level, because that's only that way we can include all these different contexts that we have been talking about that are so important to understand learning and education in a more global context.
Thank you. I see Grégoire and Joe.
Je voulais simplement justement...
Yes, I would like to echo what Nienke just said. The whole challenge is precisely what you just raised. That is, what's in the report is also the gaps, the places where we haven't done enough research. And what you just raised is very obvious. There's a lot of research only in the global north and how we think north-north, south-south, or north-south relationships. So we need to see how we move from things that work in certain contexts and how they can be globalized in a way, and if it's relevant or not to do so. Because sometimes when we work with some African countries, we can see that the problem is that in a classroom there are 100 students. Obviously, you can't do the same thing as in France, where the classroom has been split in two in terms of the number of students. So there's a whole challenge. How can we address such challenges, keeping in mind that general rules in education are applicable to all? William James said that all tides are different, but the rules governing tides are all the same. So we can work on general principles that are always relevant, whatever the context. Then we can test them out in concrete context. So how do we move from a smaller scale to a larger scale? Sometimes when you work at a local level, then you move on to a bigger scale and it doesn't work anymore. As you know, at the beginning, everyone is interested and motivated, and then when you try to scale up, you have barriers. So you need to do research. How do you work on larger scale implementation? That's the whole point of the report. What are the gaps and where do we need to invest to succeed in assessment, whatever the context is, and how the context impacts the effects. Thank you. I see that there are two additional questions from this side of the room. Madam, please. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you to our panelists. I'm the permanent delegate of the Syrian Republic to UNESCO. I'm very happy to listen to this debate. Thank you for this great report. It is very long, but we will read it with a lot of interest. We'd like to thank all experts who took part in this report. Thank you to UNESCO, Education, the Gandhi Institute. Thank you to Quebec, and the moderators, including Ms. Lacqueuille. So what I would like to say today is that Syria will definitely benefit from this report, because since September 2021, Syria made a decision at the level of the Ministry of Education setting up the so-called social education system. So it's a new curriculum, 2 hours that are now part of the curriculum from primary to secondary school. It's based on 4 pillars targeting the emotional flourishing of individuals with families, within cities, within the rural area, and at the level of the whole of society, insisting on acquired innate skills, knowing that many students suffered a lot for 10 years because of the war in Syria. So that was an extraordinary experience. It required significant investment from the state and the Ministry of Education, and we are going to keep a close eye on this initiative. So with the support of UNESCO and the UNESCO Beirut office, we are going to keep a close eye on this experiment, and we're going to use this document. I'm pretty sure that is going to be used. I'll do everything that I can so that we can follow up and provide you with an interim report on the outcomes of the assessment. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you very much to you.
Thank you. Let me start to thank the panelists, and it's great to see the final report out. I've seen it, your last time here in Paris. My comment and request to UNESCO, I think, we have a great report, very rich, but I think, unless we utilize it to the max, I think we failed. That's what's my belief. And I think here, my question is more to the UNESCO and to the Director General, specifically. I think this needs to be promoted. Again, we can sit here all day unless it's been promoted correctly. And, for example, I think, we have in September, the Summit in Transforming Education. I think, this report should be an side event. So people, to me, this is a no-brainer to promote it for the whole world. Secondly, usually in July you have the high-level political forum for the SDGs, where the decision makers are there. So this report should be, also promoted, and this is the role of I think the role of UNESCO to do. Also, we're talking about, on the education working group in the G20. The education group in G20, they get their information, the input from UNESCO. So, this should be also, can be benefit, the reported benefit. You have also in the World Economic Forum, we have the private sectors, this is where, I think that the right place to be, promoted and to be utilized. So this is my message to UNESCO, to move forward in this report. It's great, we'll be talking, I looked at it yesterday, there's a huge amount of information in it, but I think the policymakers and decision makers, they need to be exposed to it, and I think this is the role of UNESCO to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, and I might have missed that, in which case I apologize. Could you introduce yourself?
My name is Adam, I'm Kuwait ambassador at UNESCO. My apologies.
Thank you very much. And considering the time, I'll take the last question from the floor. Madam.
I'm from Sri Lanka, ambassador and permanent delegate to UNESCO. Thank you very much for this very interesting and very informative panel discussion. My question, I don't know whether it is relevant to this forum. Even though we have high literacy rate in many countries, in secondary schools, there are dropouts. Has it been addressed in this 11 sections? I'm yet to read it. Has it been addressed? This is my question. And as the Kuwait ambassador said, I think we have to consider this, the implementation also. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. Who would like to address Nandini?
Sure, we have made attempts to address the possible reasons why there are high dropouts, but they're distributed across the chapters in different contexts. There are a number of factors responsible. They could be emotional, they could be because of learning differences, because of political, because of migration issues. So there are a number of reasons that might be responsible for dropouts, and they have been discussed in different contexts. And adolescence is a particularly tender age when this does begin to see higher numbers. So I hope you find relevant information in it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds, Anand.
He takes advantage of the previous friendship. It gives me 30 seconds. But Madam, from Ivory Coast, I think you may have brought in a very interesting point. This is the first assessment, so it was always a challenge to put together something for the first time, especially for academics or experts who are not used to such an initiative. But based on previous assessments in other fields, I think the response I would provide is when we do this in the next time round, which I will talk a little bit about later, is sub-regional assessments, where then you sort of have more focus and you get the experts from that area, and then they understand a lot more of the context, the challenges, and the environment under which then the policy recommendations that emerge make a lot more sense. So, and then of course the bigger challenge then would be to sort of see synergy between the global and the sub-regional, and then you can see where areas which are kind of going ahead, those which have been left behind, and how they can learn from each other and stuff like that. So that's the response I would that I would bring forward, and I will leave the rest when the MC gives me that possibility at the end of the session.
So thank you very much for all the questions from the floor, and to the panelists for the answers, and continuing a social experiment, so to speak. I wanted to invite the moderators of the panel from the point of view of their, permanent delegates' role, together with the co-chairs of the assessment, Ananta and Ninke, to indicate what next, how we can take the assessment forward, both from the point of view of, further work on really the assessment side, but also, and this is why I wanted to hear from Vera Lacquey and Michel Bonsin, from the point of view of possible policy implications / applications. Thank you.
Well, thank you for giving us this opportunity. I was going to ask a question like my colleague to deal with this issue, actually, because of course you will tell us what next on your side, but for us it is also important to know what next on our side. I mean, we're not policymakers in our national context, but we are decision makers here in UNESCO. Many of us are members of the board and take decisions on UNESCO's work in the field of education and everything else. And from my perspective, this report is groundbreaking, and it has to impact the work of education in UNESCO, whether in the field or at headquarters. And from our perspective, we think that this should lead to some decision-making in the board on how to use this report and to make sure that we make the best use of it. And maybe you have an opinion on this or not, Ananta, whether you see how this could move forward from the perspective of policymaking in UNESCO, decision-making in UNESCO. Now, the ambassador of Kuwait launched the first idea, which is to lobby for this report, to show this report all over the world, whether in New York or in other fora discussing education. I think, of course, this is an excellent idea, but I think we should also do more, even here at the level of the governing bodies of UNESCO, to make sure that the member states are going to get assistance from UNESCO in implementing these recommendations. Thank you.
Merci, Vera.
Thank you, Vera. Just a quick word on my side. First of all, I should like to congratulate you. Congratulations for the quality of the questions and comments. Over the last 2 years, I took part in many interesting UNESCO events, but this one really stands out. You've done an incredible amount of work, and the way in which you presented the report to the people in the room was just fabulous. So thank you so very much, and huge congratulations to you. Now, personally, I should just like to say that well, I couldn't come up with anything very accurate because there are a lot of questions that come to mind. We've kept a close eye, of course, on your answers. We believe that there are different avenues for the next step, but what is for sure is that this report needs to be implemented in different countries, in different contexts, in the north, in the south, and that raises the question of how it can be enforced in an equal manner in different countries. For instance, in Quebec, we have more than 50% of our budget that goes to education, and yet we have huge challenges. Every single day we hear about challenges in education that were highlighted during the pandemic. Even our quote-unquote rich countries struggled to adapt. Teachers did not know really how to maneuver at the beginning of the pandemic, and that was a challenge even in the north, even in countries where we pump a lot of money into education. So I think that we need to put some thought now into a kind of cooperation that between states and between different regions of the world. Other thought that also comes to mind is the digital divide. I mean, this was mentioned in passing earlier, but we've seen that the education system had to shift pretty much overnight to a new model. Now, in countries where there's a lot of money, we were able to quickly pivot, but in these countries, it was still very painful. So we need to think about the future because we're still in a pandemic, and it's very obvious that things have changed, and we will never go back to the education model as it was pre-pandemic. Now, likewise for digital tools in education, how are we going to factor in AI into education? And when we talk about differences between learners, are we going to be able, with AI, make sure that everybody has their own position, their own place in the world? And who's going to control this and govern AI? So a lot of questions that come to mind. I have many others. Lots of questions, no answers, I must admit. I don't know if you have any of the answers, but it's nonetheless just staggering what we've been going through over the last 2 years. And we're not even seeing the beginning of the consequences for the future, especially in the area of education. So thank you very much once again.
Ninke, would you like to tell us a little bit what your plans are with regard to addressing further questions that you may have, the assessment itself may have identified, and how do you see the work continue, including in relation to the needs that both Vera and Michel referred to, as well as some of the participants? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I would like to focus on the research part of the what's next question. So in addition to all the findings and messages, the assessment has also exposed where data and evidence is still missing. So I would like to emphasize the recommendation for reorganizing research funding to enable the research community to address these gaps. And many have been discussed during this panel discussion, but I would like to stress once more that it's really important that research must include more diversity, more interdisciplinarity, and practice research collaborations. And in terms of diversity, this has come up several times during this discussion. So we have seen in the assessment that many specific groups of students have been excluded from mainstream education research, and that this is a problem, right? Because drawing conclusions from context-specific or homogeneous groups can lead to suboptimal practices and suboptimal and unequal learning outcomes. And actually, this also applies to education technology, which we have also discussed. So much of the development of emerging edtech is also being produced in Western higher education institutions. So it's also very important to expand this database and to adapt edtech when it will be introduced to other cultures and contexts. So we need also the data for that. So, and about interdisciplinarity and research practice collaborations, I think we discussed the importance of including all the stakeholders from the education community in our research much more systematically in one of the the answers to one of the questions. So I would like to focus to finish by saying some more about the need for interdisciplinary research. So we have also seen and discussed today that we really need different perspectives to understand the diverse contexts of learning and education. So it's a bit like maybe you are familiar with the story of the blind and the elephant. That every blind person feels a different part of the elephant, but they need each other to understand that it is an elephant, to understand the elephant. So this is what we also need in research. We need each other to really understand education in its context globally. And finally, I would like to reflect, so we've been talking about education, that it's a social process and that social relations are so important. And this is what we have been experiencing also during this project, that for interdisciplinary projects, we also need to see it as a social process, and we need the social emotional skills that we have been discussing that are so necessary in education. We need to know how to communicate with each other, to trust each other. So I guess I just wanted to say that doing interdisciplinary research is definitely not without challenge. So it should be, I think, recognized that there is a process that we also need to attend to, this social part of interdisciplinary research and assessments like the one we are here for today. Thank you.
So I'll focus on more on the institutional process, and maybe a response to Vera as well as the ambassador from Kuwait. Immediately, in terms of this assessment, what we intend to do over the next year, or rather this year, is to have regional workshops. Immediately after this, we will be going to Dubai with the invitation from the Swedish Pavilion, where we will be hosting something very similar in Dubai, and hopefully for the MENA region, about this report at the Expo. After which we will be trying to organize one in Latin America, then one in Africa, and I think we are pretty much close to doing one in Asia Pacific with the Bangkok office. So we'll do this mostly with our regional offices, plus authors from those regions. And I think with the 45 countries, we most probably will cover in the 5 regions. So that's the immediate one for 2022. But I have a much more ambitious agenda based on the experience with, and Ariko and us, myself and others were part of those conspirators, where we set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, similar to IPCC. And I see a vision of doing something similar for education, an institutional process, which is kind of done every 5 years or so, where we have data that has been collected in this particular first assessment, and then every 4 or 5 years we update that information. We see where the gaps are, where the knowledge has improved, where we have changed. So it's a consistent set of data. So we don't have to compare apples and oranges every time we do something like this. And founded on science and evidence, because I think that has to become kind of mainstreamed. When you ask me about UNESCO and how this affects UNESCO, that this becomes mainstreamed across all UNESCO activities in education. It's grounded in science and evidence. And when I say science, I talk about not just the discipline, but the process. I think it's very important. And with that, we start building a systematic database that reduces the fragmented landscape that we right now see on data and evidence from education. Very fragmented. And I think we need to start putting that into order. Because AI is going to be there to stay. And I think when we talk about personalized education, AI will play a major role in that. But we got to do it right. We are going to live in, I don't think we're going to live in the metaverse as Mr. Zuckerberg would like us to do, but I'm sure we will live in the mixed reality where we are moving back from virtual to real. And for that, a new education system has to be designed. Our present education systems don't even come close to handling those new realities that we are facing. So I think these are the things that we are thinking of, and the Institute will continue pushing for the science and evidence, and hopefully we will bring it into as a DNA within UNESCO. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, first of all, I'd like to propose that we give the panel a big applause, and that I would like the moderators to please stand, because we can't really see you. So, thank you very much. Now, we would like to conclude with some remarks by Peje Emilsson, who is an entrepreneur, founder of Kreb and Kunskapsskolan. Peje, please.
Thank you very much. You know, I'm not a scientist or professor, not even a policymaker, but I have had the pleasure and privilege to be part of the advisory board for this fascinating project. My contribution has mostly been to listen and understand, but I also said, please simplify, make sure that you get the message across. And I think you have done that in a perfect way so that everyone interested in education can understand what this really means. I'm an entrepreneur in education. I started a school over 20 years ago in Sweden, and we have today 15,000 students in Sweden and 15,000 students outside Sweden, in the US, in the UK, in the Netherlands, in India, and in Saudi Arabia. I have met dozens of ministers of education. I have discussed with them how can you share experiences from other educational systems? How can you learn from others? And I have met those that have said, no way, education we handle in our country completely. But what I've seen during the last 10 years is a growing interest to get rid of those silos and to accept ideas from others and see how can we improve education. And it's in that respect, this initiative is so important, and the conclusion is so important. For policymakers, if you read not only this, but the full report, there is a gold mine of experience, ideas, which can be used to improve the educational systems in various countries. I'm mostly impressed with 3 points that I think are so important. The first one is the fact that personalized learning is a human right. That is a thought that not many had 20 years ago. So very important, because it can have dramatic implications in the future. And the other one is that we are talking about potentiality, not meritocracy. The important thing is to let each one make use of its own resources to compete against oneself, not against others. The third part that is just briefly in this is the funding. I think we spend between 2, 3, 4, up to 15% of GDP on education in different countries. We spend it in a very different way. Some people we spend 3 to 4 times more than others. And I think we have a very interesting area in the future to look how we finance education to make sure that no child is left behind. And I also think here that we can get good experiences between countries. Each country is sovereign when it comes to handle education, but each country can open up and learn more from others. Technology can have a dramatic impact on the way we develop education in the future. And it means definitely that we will move into more and more looking at educating the global generation. So that's why this initiative is so important. And I think we that are working in education hope very much that it will continue and provide tools worldwide to provide a better generation for the global generation. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Peje, for those very important final and encouraging remarks. Once again, thank you to all panelists and also to you participants, and feel free to stay in touch with all of us, all of the experts on the podium with regard to how this exercise can be applied and is planned to be taken forward. I would like now to invite the panelists and the moderators to be on the podium for a group photo together with the full report, as well as the supporting UNESCO and Mahatma Gandhi Institute team. And once again, thank you very much for your support. The picture will take just 1 minute, and those of you who are interested to have a chat with some of the experts, please stay. Thank you. And for those of you who are interested, you have a chance to interact with the panelists now. They are coming down. Thank you once again. Thank you.